The Bigger Picture of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. James Felton Keith is an award-winning engineer and an economist who was the first Black LGBTQ person to run for US Congress. He currently lectures on inclusion at the University of Georgia's Terry College of Business. Shout out to Georgia, that's where I went as well, as an activist. His data unions redefine the labor movement and personal data as the natural resource driving all corporate productivity. As an entrepreneur, he established the first international diversity and inclusion certification and the first insurance policy for a lack of inclusion based on an inclusion score. As an author, his biopolitical philosophy, Inclusionism, is at the forefront of international relations and human rights diplomacy. Working between government and business, he regularly says it's necessary to have the mind of a CEO and the heart of a social worker to solve real people's problems. Welcome today, James. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here. That was a mouthful. I'm kind of embarrassed when I hear all that bio, but
well, we're happy to have you here, and I'm sure Zara is going to take the lead here. She's the global DEI strategist and trainer at Power to Fly, and we look forward to hearing more of all the great work that you're doing, James. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Mariella, for that introduction. Welcome, James, to the summit. We're looking forward to what you have to share about DEI and B in the hybrid and remote workspace. First, though, could you tell us a little bit more about your inclusionism philosophy?
Sure. I mean, inclusionism is what we would call a biopolitical philosophy. We actually have a new book that just came out today. It's a bit nerdy. It's a bit of an academic book. It's called Inclusionism in the Time of COVID-19. But inclusionism in 3 bullet points is really the notion that people have an intrinsic value. Number 2, that they can only derive that value from interactions with each other. And 3rd, that they are entitled to some ownership or equity in the value that proliferates from our interaction. It's really a physics analogy, right? It's the idea that if we think about particles having friction and, from those particles moving and having friction, we see energy transpire. We like to think about value just as we do energy. So value is like that of energy, but instead of particles moving and having friction and creating energy, data is transacted by us. This conversation is data transacting. When we bump into each other on the streets, when we do our business, that's data transacting. And from those transactions, we quantify those in the value. Gross domestic product, or what we call GDP, is really just a measure of transactions. So what we're saying is that we can prove in a factual way that people have an intrinsic value because we see it transpire as they bump up against each other and interact day in and day out. And so inclusionism is a play on how we distribute that value back to the people that it's rightfully owed to, because they have intrinsic value. Yeah. Are you frozen? Oh. Slightly frozen? No?
I'm back. I'm so sorry about that. But thank you so much for that analogy, James. I also think it's interesting. I've never thought about DEIB work as like scientifically. So that's a unique way of looking at it. And as you mentioned, your book came out today, which is very exciting. And I'm sure you talk a little bit more about that as well. And we'll chat about that a little bit later in our conversation also. Yeah. But so I know that you started a company to really help organizations calculate their own inclusion scores.
So I think she's having some technical difficulties
metrics
here.
Are involved.
Okay.
And
Hello. Can you hear me, James?
Yeah, I can hear you. I think I got most of what she said, though. I can try to still.
Absolutely.
That. Yeah, so I mean, look, we created an inclusion score. It's a software company, but it's really based on a 12-year effort at the International Organization for Standards. So over these past 12 years, we've worked across 163 countries, across more than 1,000 top tier DEI professionals to really agree on how we codify what DEI and B are, right? Or what they can be. But I should pause there and sort of differentiate everything we know or think we know about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Those are big ideas and things that we want to grow into. You know, diversity is a fact of life, equity is a choice, inclusion is an act, and belonging is hopefully the end result of all of those things coming together. But the ISO standard, that's what we call the International Organization for Standards for short, and inclusion score are really an effort to inject DEI and B into what we call 32 different domains of inclusivity. Those 32 domains really fit into 4 big buckets though. Corporate governance, things we do with executives, corporate human resources, things we do with our employees, but also corporate product delivery, things we do with our products, whether they're services or something more tangible. And last but not least, supplier diversity, things we do with the companies that supply in or partner with us to deliver the products and services that we deliver. And so the metrics that we're looking at inclusion score and the metrics that are demanded by the ISO 30415 standard are really internal corporate policy across those 4 large buckets or the 32 domains that they extrapolate out into. And what we're able to do now that we've codified what DEI and B are, is we can start to workflow manage it, right? So it can become more scientific, and it can become a bit more of a business change process, because now we know exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about any of these domains, again, whether they be organizational governance, HR, supplier diversity, or product delivery. And so at Inclusion Score, we provide, I would say, the world's leading platform for what we call D&I service management. And we help a lot of large risk management companies like PricewaterhouseCoopers or Zurich Insurance Group to engage some of the largest companies on the planet and a lot of their really tiny suppliers to understand how they might gradually become more mature at implementing diversity and inclusion initiatives going forward. Did I lose you there? Oh.
So it looks like Zara is having some technical difficulties. So I'm going to jump in because I'm super interested also in learning about you, especially after reading your bio and seeing that you've worked with the University of Georgia. So I would just love to take a few steps back into, the work that you do and what gives you the fuel to continue to speak to these topics that are being brought up, more and more in the industry. Something that I have been really annoyed with is seeing performative allyship. And you've been in the game for a while. I love that the quote that I mentioned, as well as you have to think like a CEO, but also have this social impact heart at play. If someone is having trouble connecting those 2 dots, what is something that they can do starting today in order to practice what they preach?
I mean, I think even the main thing that we teach down at UGA, so we're at the Terry College of Business down there. And I'm normally based in New York. I'm in the great state of Ohio today, but an hour after this, I'll be teaching that course because we start up at noon Eastern. But what we're teaching these students and mainly is, and they're business folks, is really when the world changes, it's really via, and it sounds horrible and sounds bland, but it really happens via businesses process change management. Like when we streamlined the world and made it more technologically savvy, there was an ISO standard that came out in the 90s, and we reconfigured what IT was. IT used to be a guy, and it was usually a guy who knew where the fax machine and the copier were. That was your hardware. That was IT in 1999, right? And then it changed to portfolio managing all sorts of incidents because we had standardized what was what. And there was a lot of people in suits and, people wear the same type of shirt every day. I'm not wearing the exact same shirt I wore yesterday, but it's close. But the point is, through that process change management and making sure that everyone understands how we do it in the same way pervasively throughout every industry is where we really start to see change. So I think there's a big difference between the DEI and B that we hear about in the streets, right? The stick, if you will, and then the carrot that goes along with that stick is really process change management. Because what's starting to happen in diversity and inclusion And the reason why we're down at the Terry College is because they're the #1 ranked risk management college in the country. And really, risk management is just code for insurance because people don't like the word insurance. But what's happening is diversity and inclusion lawsuits in this country alone are way above $5 billion a year. And when a company gets sued or is threatened to be sued, who usually pays the bill is their insurance company. So just like how we used to look at cyber risk 10 years ago, everyone was getting hacked, like I can't do anything here. Insurers were like, well, we're going to stop paying the bill if you don't show us that you have the ability to manage this risk. You cannot transfer the risk if you can't show us that you manage it. And so the same thing is happening with D&I now, where lawsuits are happening and insurance companies are footing the bill, and they're telling the S&P 500 and the 50,000 companies that cater into those 500 huge companies, they're saying, you have to manage this now, or you're going to have to eat this cost, period. So there's a new incentive, there's a new carrot, if you will, to go along with the stick for DEI and B. And that's really, that's the hack. And so what's really driving me to answer your question is, I try to wear a pink shirt and sometimes I wear a tie to button it up and keep me calm, but I'm an angry Black man from Detroit who lives in Harlem, and, I'm mainly PO'd about things. But, I'm reasonable. I can work with people if they want to gradually mature through the standardization of inclusivity. And that's what we're here to do, is sort of standardize inclusivity. I'm not sure if I'm a little off the rocker.
No, yes.
Yeah,
I'm just gonna shout out, because you are helping me to reflect on Brother James Baldwin, may he rest in peace and power, because you're bringing all the realness here. I love the analogy of the carrot and the stick as well. And thank the goddesses that there is more of an incentive now, because otherwise maybe we'd just be crossing our fingers. Hopefully not too many people get in trouble because they really are practicing from the heart. So thank you, James, for diving in there. Zara, let's see if we can hear you now.
Yeah, absolutely. I love how real you are, James. I love that you brought that like honesty and transparency into this space. I think we really need that when we talk about DEI and B work, so I just want to personally thank you for kind of bringing that vulnerability into this space. And I apologize. We were talking about making things more tech savvy, and I'm having some technical difficulties today myself, but I'm very interested in kind of picking back into our conversation. So if job seekers that are listening to this talk really want to measure the DEI and B of a potential employer, how can they do that?
I think you start with an audit. And I think the coolest thing is nowadays will be, because of our tech or the standard alone, if folks want to use it, you can walk into any firm knowledgeable now and say, I think we need to start with an audit to see where we are. It doesn't mean the audit's published and we're trying to embarrass companies, et cetera. But if you start with the rigor of this standard, because the best of the best have agreed upon this across 163 countries, then you're in a better place to then go back and reflect with the top leadership of that company, say, where can we afford to make investments now to show all of our stakeholders, whether they're employees or consumers, that we have a growth plan. Like, I remember the week after George Floyd was murdered, my phone was blowing up from CEOs like, can you do a talk? Can we do this? I said, we can do anything you want for, $5,000 plus expenses, but it will not change your corporate culture, and it will not satisfy the folks that work at your firm. It will not make new people want to come and work at your firm. And so I was like, you need to sort of start with an audit and then look at where you can scale from there. So I would say to any new person coming in or any person looking to transition into this space is that you really want to leverage the standard and this broader process that we call diversity and inclusion service management to walk your way into making your firm more inclusive. I should also say to the really young people that the #2 type of new job on LinkedIn last year was some sort of diversity officer or equity and inclusion officer. They're using different language, but someone in that vein. So I would say you start there and you make it about the process, the organizational process, not just the warm fuzzy, which we need. We need all these programs that folks are doing, but making it about process at a company is the best way to actually inflict change on that company, because that's the work that we all do every day, is really process change management. Something happened, we need to update a doc, blah, 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 have a meeting. That's what real people do every day. And now we're doing it virtually. So it's a lot easier to do.
Right. Absolutely. And I love this like very sort of base starting point that you named around auditing. You know, even at Power to Fly, when we are doing work with clients like that, it's all about, that's the place to start, right? Like you can't, how are you going to know where to get to if you don't know where you currently are, right? So I love that's really sort of like the starting point for you all as well. And I know, so you talk about economic inclusion in your work. So what do you mean by this? And how does, you know, you've mentioned sort of tech savvy and us being in a virtual environment now. How does remote and hybrid work impact economic inclusion?
Yeah, I mean, well, for number one, I think, you know, remote work or the availability of it has allowed a lot more people to participate in parts of the workforce that they normally wouldn't have been able to because just of their locale or other limitations. But, you know, when I'm thinking about economic inclusion, it's sort of my broader, you know, driver. And when I look at what we're doing with the ISO standard or with inclusion score, the grand goal is really to demonstrate to companies that if they are leveraging inclusivity well, then their employees and consumers will be adequately engaged and feel like there's some hope and that this company is getting better and better providing them the services and products that they need. But also, if we do this really well, we should be able to include all the global participants, all 8 billion of us, in the normal economy. And it goes back to how I talked about inclusionism earlier, about, you know, the sort of the friction of life proliferating value. And we need to incentivize more friction. We need to incentivize more engagement, more interaction, more transaction of our lives, of our identities and how we exist in the world. And the best way to do that is to methodologically design in the invite for folks to come and participate with us. And that may be a job, it may be a contract, it may be some sort of supplier agreement, et cetera. But I think if in, you know, the next decade or so, we have adequately and methodologically codified inclusivity and implemented it across the board, not just here in the United States, but everywhere across every industry, then we'll start to see workforce engagement enhance. And I think we'll also start to see how people engage the workforce radically change from you need to live in the city that you work in to I'm doing it remotely, or I'm doing 2 or 3 things. So yeah, I think we're in an interesting new time because we have these new methods and tools. And the pandemic really, as tragic as it was, it shined a light on how we can exist versus how we have, and the politic of how we have over the past, you know, millennia.
Yeah, I love that. I love also just being real about where we are in the world right now. Kind of like dealing with the pandemic has really definitely shifted the way that people even think about work. So
my
I
whole
love
company
that.
grew on this. I mean, when I think about remote work, even from on my own side, like to do the deals that we've done with some large global firms, it would have been a lot of plane flights, a lot of handshakes, a lot of hotel stays. We grew to 343 different companies via Zoom and WebEx, but not Microsoft Teams because it never worked for us. But those other two, yeah. So change it. It changed it. Sometimes we weren't even wearing pants, but we usually were wearing pants. But sometimes we were not wearing pants. But yeah.
James, I love it. I love how real you are. And you know, again, it's so interesting because a lot of times people, especially now, you know, people have been talking about how being virtual has affected mental health, and there's very real ramifications of that. But on the flip side, like you mentioned, it's also allowed for such rapid growth and being able to connect in a way that you might not have been able to do otherwise either. And I think it is important to kind of to name that as well. So thank you for bringing that here. So James, I know that you mentioned your book comes out today, which is super exciting. So both in your book, as well as in your overall work, you refer to this idea of data as labor. Could you explain that idea, and how does that really relate to the future of work?
Well, when I think what got me into data is I've always been, you know, as a kid growing up where I grew up and how I grew up, I've always been thinking about my own value, how I value myself, and how I could sort of try to accrue some, because I didn't have much to start with. And my fascination with data, and even data as labor, is really more around, I think, data of different sorts, personal data that we input onto institutions that we interact with or other individuals that we interact with, is the most micro input to productivity, period, at every firm. Firms they only make two things, right? They make products, things you can touch, and services, things you can't touch. And they only do it in two ways: via employees who either know something about a market of people, or actual people, consumers, who tell you via their personal data what they are. And the way companies grow in valuation, grow in revenues, et cetera, or expectations of revenues, which is valuation, is based on that data, right? And so my argument is, if my data is an input to your productivity, right? If I am cool and Mark Zuckerberg is not, and I make Facebook cooler because I'm on it, the question should be asked, what am I owed from my input to that value? Right. And so it's not just that firm, right? It's every firm that we interact with, of any sort. They're making engineering products that, hammer down in the street, and some engineer, she's like, I think we need to put on this corner versus that corner because there's more people traffic, because she knows the area and she lives right there. That micro input is above and beyond whatever her salary is. A salary is like a retainer for your time, right? But if your time is very valuable to your company and it enhances that company's value, the question should be asked after the fact, right? After value has proliferated, what am I owed from that? Probably not the whole market value, but a piece of it. So when we think about labor and the labor movement, especially as we move further into this digital age, labor can't just be toiling physically, right? Labor has to also be what my input does for space or a place over time. And so we write a lot about data ethics. We've tried to write a lot of digital rights and ethics in the European laws, and we think that's starting to influence what we have over here in the US. But again, that goes back to inclusivity, right? I think right now we differentiate tech from people, but if all the tech that we're building right now is just codifying what people are to distribute products and services back to them that they need, right? When I see that you have long hair, I would recommend different types of hair care products for you than I would me. But I have that data now. I know that about you because you're here on Zoom. And I think that the question that we're asking around inclusivity is, can we quantify and distribute that adequately? And I think the answer is yes. I think we can, because the tech and the algos exist. We've done it a few times. And so I just think scale that out.
That's so, it's so interesting. You're pushing my thinking again. We start off this conversation talking about like physics analogies, right? And like, what's the scientific correlation between, behind like DEIB? And now it's also like this idea of micro inputs, right? And like that whole concept that you just mentioned around data is labor. It's such a unique way of thinking about it. It's definitely got me mulling it over a little bit. So thank you for that. And I was going to say, James, we have some questions from the audience, which we do have a few minutes to get to. Yeah. So I'm excited to kind of pull forth some audience thoughts. So the first question we have is, what would you say is the most difficult part of implementing a DEI program?
I think the most difficult part from implementing a DEI program is understanding where to start. I think a lot of DEI programs right now, in my opinion, over the course of the past 60 years, DEI programs are reactions to crises. And so you'll see DEI officers of varied sorts with a mission. It may be gender specific or race specific or other sort of specific. And those are what we would call, in my world, projects, right? So companies do 4 types of things with regards to DEI. They either train people to do stuff that they didn't know about. They do data extraction. They do internal infrastructure. Those are like employee resource groups, business resource groups, or they do external infrastructure. We're giving to the Girl Scouts, or we're at affinity groups. We're working with the LGBT chamber now, blah, blah, blah. Those are all projects. But what we haven't had before is a way to audit and codify where those projects should fit across the varied domains of your business operation. So right now, DEI efforts, and I think where they fail and where they lack resources from CFOs and CEOs, is they are not a clear part of the business's change management that grow the business. They are about, reacting to crises in the business. And that's problematic. But I don't see that being our future in the 2020s. I think there'll be a very new path going forward.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And also, I know Mariella had mentioned this earlier, but the whole concept of performative allyship and performative work. And I think a
That
lot
was
of
a great word.
companies.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I said performative is the precisely the right word.
Yes.
F. Henderson, one of my co-founders, who's the lead convener of the ISO standard, when they talk about the standard, it asks for internal corporate policy across these varied domains, and it insists on intentionality. So even if you get it wrong, right, you left somebody out, et cetera, you can come back and change that and ratify it over time as you learn more. So there's an intentional maturity or intentional growth. You're always going to start where you start, right? I can't even begin to explain how many times I've gotten things wrong about women in the workforce, because at the end of the day, I'm a guy, I'm a suit, and I wear this all day. I've got issues. But the point is, it is about not being performative, being intentional, and then coming back and constantly modifying that intentionality to be more inclusive.
Yeah, I love that. That intentional and strategic piece is so crucial. So we have another question for you, which is, how would companies, so at some point you had referenced inviting people from underrepresented groups, or like having folks kind of involved in conversations, and someone is asking, how would companies go about inviting those people from underrepresented groups?
I think you have to, insist on it. Like, I have literally seen companies try to plan an International Women's Day event from a board of all men, and they thought that they were doing a noble allied thing. Like, well, you didn't invite any other women in to chime in on what should be happening, in March. And they honestly just hadn't thought about that. And again, it goes back to, at the highest leadership level possible, you have to insist on intentional policies that say, if we're going to do a specific thing, for instance, in recruiting or in workforce planning or in supplier diversity or in our inclusive culture, which is a category of the ISO standard, we need to bullet point in a 1 or 2 page or supplementary policy separately to what we have, to see how we plan on including one of the, like, for instance, at Inclusion Score, we track 27 different types of diversity. And it's not that there's not more diversity in the world, but we track these 27 types because they're the types that come up in legal dockets and in HR. So they may start with a few groups, right? They might start with gender, race, ethnicity, and disability. They may not have added vets and LGBT and other sort of neurodiversity and people who come from poor backgrounds, you name it. So I think you have to go back to what corporations do well, which is the reason that they exist, is they do process design better than individuals do. And so if you start to make these teams, these homogenous looking teams, insist on becoming more inclusive, and they keep bringing in more people either from inside the company or inside the organization or folks from outside, you start to see that gradually change. But the only way to get that done outside of orgs that aren't already, I don't really like the term melting pot, but aren't already sort of like salad bowls. Because in melting pot, everyone turns into fondue, but in salad bowls, you're sort of like, everyone is still what they are, covered in hopefully the same dressing. But anyway, the point is, you have to be intentional about designing policy that invites folks in. I don't think that any group of unknowing people are going to have aha moments. The majority of us are not philosophers, and they're not just going to say, where can we find all the Asian women? It's not a trigger for them. And so you have to be insistent on building it in the organizational policy.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that again, it all comes back to, and I've just been hearing this pattern in a lot of what you've been saying around just that intentional piece. Like, there has to be intentionality behind everything that a company does when it comes to DEIB work. So, I just want to thank you, James. I know that we are at time. I know I've learned a lot, and I'm taking some things away that I'm definitely going to be mulling over. And I know that the audience has been very excited and engaged as well during this chat. So again, a huge thank you to you, James, for coming here, spending some time with us, sharing your own insight. And as mentioned earlier, James had a book that's coming out today. So please look into that as well and keep an eye out for that. And with that, James, again, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. All right. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Zara. James, I'm going to pick up that book. Thank you for taking your time to write that. And I appreciate the work that you're doing. Thank you so much.